Before we go into our interview today, I wanted to let everyone know we have a new sponsor for our Energy Question podcast, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, or USOGA for short. First established in 1917, USOGA has been an effective and creative voice for the industry for more than a century now. USOGA is dedicated to educating the public, policymakers, and legislators at the federal, state, and local levels about the value of the domestic oil and natural gas industry. If you're in the industry and not currently a USOGA member, please consider joining the association as a way of helping it tell your story to the policymakers whose actions impact everything you do each and every day. You can start that process by contacting USOGA through its website, usoga.org. Thanks so much to USOGA for sponsoring the Energy Question podcast. And now on with our show. Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm your host, David Blackmon, and my special guest today is Hugo Kruger, an energy analyst from South Africa. He had me on his podcast about a month ago, and it was terrific. This guy is incredibly knowledgeable about not just things happening in South Africa, which really don't get enough coverage here in the United States, but really globally as well, the whole energy picture. Hugo, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me, and thank you to your listeners.
Hey, before we go into the Q&A, just give people a little, take 2 or 3 minutes, give us some background on how you got involved in energy and how much fun you're having these days.
Well, the nice thing about crazy times is that it's the best times for jokes and humor, right? So I'll start over there, and I enjoy your Substack for that reason. So a little bit about me. I studied civil engineering as a background. So for those who don't know, civil engineers work in civilian infrastructure. And that also includes, obviously, electricity systems, sewage systems, water systems, any network system, really. We sort of analyze it from a more broader perspective, and also some people sub-branch into construction and into energy and different fields. So I studied a bachelor's in civil engineering. Then I worked in South Africa for 2 years. I got working experience before I did a master's because I felt I didn't want to go to grad school directly. And I worked in cement, first in telecommunications for about 6 months. And then I worked in the cement industry, which is attached to the energy sector in a different way. We use fly ash, which is the byproduct of coal, in cement to improve the properties. Now, good way to explain this, for example, the Hoover Dam, when they built it years ago, they didn't add fly ash to the cement, so they have to use the water from the dam to cool it, the hydration process, so it doesn't crack. But South Africa, where most of the world these days, the cement doesn't do that anymore. We don't need to cool it because of the properties from the ash from coal. So I worked on that process, understood it very well. And then I started learning French because we were working for a French company at the time. And then our lecturer said, listen, there's a scholarship for those who want to do a master's in France. So I applied initially with the intention of studying material science, but then the enrollment closed. So I got the scholarship without getting into university yet. So I applied for a random degree. It's one of those things. I didn't say I didn't get in yet because I didn't want to lose the scholarship. So I applied then for nuclear without knowing much about it. And then I did my master's in the design of nuclear power stations. Then I worked for about 2 years on the design of Hinkley Point C in the UK. I did one of the concrete designs over there. And then I was down to Aix-en-Provence in the south of France, where I worked in nuclear fusion, where I designed again some of the structures over there with the tokamak assembly preparation building, which is sort of my baby. Then afterwards, in the last few years, then I got a job offer to go into the LNG Institute because they just paid a higher salary. And I thought, you know what? Let's see how they do things, because they seem, whatever you think of the fossil fuel industry, they seem to get things done on time. The nuclears can learn a lot from them in that respect, EPC contracting, things of that nature. Yeah. So I worked on projects in Russia. I'm now working on a project in Indonesia. And actually from next year, I'm going back to work on France's small modular reactors. I'm going back to nuclear, taking the great lessons from the oil and gas industry, which I think is so complementary to the nuclear industry.
It is. It really is. And of course, I think you and I agree, and we talked about this on your own podcast, that if we're ever going to approach anything resembling net zero, which probably is not really even possible, but, to dramatically reduce emissions the way the activists want to reduce them, aren't we going to have to really have a pretty massive expansion in nuclear power generation, really all over the world?
We are, but I do caution against that as well. So I'm an energy mix person. I'm a traditional base loader for coal, for nuclear. LNG has, its potential as load following, balancing intermittency. I even believe in solar and wind. I worked in offshore wind as well, which I forgot to mention, by the way. So I've worked in all the energy sources. There are 7 energy sources in the world, right? And I'm going to go down the list to tell people the issues with them. First, let's start with the renewables, wind and solar. They work very nice when there's wind and sun. And and when there's none,
Yes.
you need to back them up. The cost of a battery needs to drop to below $50 per kilowatt hour. They're currently at 500. Okay, so they're too expensive, battery included. And they run into another issue, which people have realized recently, grid space. South Africa's transmission line for renewables is full. So we need to build a transmission line 60% the circumference of the earth. That's just for South Africa. That's not going to happen tomorrow. Okay, so those guys have to chill a bit. Okay, those are the first two. Then you have hydropower, the most excellent technology with the obvious problem. Not every country's got water. South Africa is the 25th driest country in water. Water is your ideal battery, so they work nice with renewables. But if you don't have water, we will struggle to incorporate them. That's why renewable expansion in Africa is constrained. Then you go for nuclear power. Excellent technology, with the exception that the last two projects in the Western country went over the roof with the explosion in cost. Industry struggles to retain skills. They require low interest rates. It's not a low interest rate environment all the time. They've got major issues with lead times, 10 years plus, and then the interest catches up with you and the project becomes uneconomical. So yeah, I'm in favor of nuclear, but that's the issue. Now let's go to the other one that you've got, which is oil. Great product, with the exception Saudi Arabia is basically the biggest player, so they can price hog. Okay, US is a bit of an exception to this, but oil expansion is limited by the constraints of OPEC. Okay, then you've got LNG. Remarkable what the US did. Again, you did it right by putting it next to your population centers. Pennsylvania, Texas, they run on LNG, but it's limited and constrained by infrastructure. Okay, so South Africa doesn't have LNG yet, and we can only build the import facility in Richards Bay. It will take 3 years from now before LNG scales in the continent. It's always 3 years from the government making the decision, and they could have made it 10 years ago. Okay, so you run into that issue. What is left?
Sounds familiar, yes.
What is left? What is the last source that nobody wants to talk about, that is so dirty, so evil, so ugly? And that remains good old King coal.
Right.
Okay, and I'm sorry, but unless you can overcome those other 6 constraints I just explained, and there are many more, those are just the major ones, coal expansion will remain a reality in this world, whatever happens at COP28. That's how I see
because it's affordable, it's accessible, it's everywhere. You don't have a problem sourcing it. You can build the plants pretty quickly. They don't cost as much as a nuclear facility.
Right.
On and on and on. So many advantages. And as we're recording this just so everyone knows, the day after the COP28 conference concluded.
Right.
You know, with this,
I'm the heretic here. Hey?
Well, but look, my favorite part of that was John Kerry, who's not even a formal official of the United States government, using himself somehow committing our country to this international agreement to get rid of, to phase out, is the language they use, unabated coal-fired power plants. Now, we haven't built an unabated coal-fired power plant in the United States in probably 40 or 50 years. Because if it's truly unabated, that means it doesn't have scrubbers. And scrubber technology became a requirement on our coal plants, I know, as early as the 1970s, and probably earlier than that. What about South Africa? Do you have unabated coal plants in South Africa?
Interesting you asked that question. So last
Maybe
year,
you do. I don't know.
no, it's a very interesting question, because last year one of the idiot operators broke the scrubber in one of the big coal power stations. Okay, and then the Minister of Environmental Affairs, before she went to COP28, had to make a trade-off analysis. Do we go with blackouts or do we go with a bit of acid rain? And she said, we're going to go with a bit of acid rain.
Well,
even coal without scrubbers reduces life expectancy by 10 weeks. It's nothing. Okay.
Right.
In a grand scheme of things. So yeah, I'd like scrubbers and clean air, but here's the problem. Not all the coal plants do it. Renewables got it. I'm all for upgrading the existing coal stations and doing life extensions on them with the clean technology and, all the environmental nice bunny stuff. But many countries don't have that luxury at the moment, especially in the developing world. And there, the price of dirty air is much better, because that means my kids can don't have to study by candlelight. That means they can have water and electricity, right? And that's the argument that's just not coming through. So unless you have an alternative to coal, I'm not the king coal because I like saying it, okay? I'd love for South Africa to move out of coal, but we have enough coal reserves just for the world for the next 500 years, okay?
Yes.
Why would we go off it unless you give me a more cost competitive product, right? And if you don't have it, sorry, I'm going to burn coal. I don't care what you say, right? And that's the attitude that the East Asian countries have got and they have the same issues as South Africa, where they are water restrained. If you've got water, you've already got a battery. Okay, that's excellent for renewables. If you don't have water, you need to build a battery, and look at Elon Musk's scam in Australia. It's not that cheap.
Right. Exactly. one of the things you talk about a lot is ESCOM,
Mhm.
the major utility company that the government in South Africa is really, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in the process of pretty much destroying. Talk about how that has evolved and the impacts on the population there.
Right. So this is a very sad story. Okay. This is really why government and politicians should not get involved in energy policy. It's the case study of how to destroy something that used to work. So South Africa, when we became a democracy in 1994, had Eskom. It had one of the best coal fleets in the world because we're a coal country. We are more coal dependent than China, right?
Yeah.
And during that time, Eskom operated independent of government. Whatever you think of the apartheid government, they didn't care about electricity. They just left those engineers to do their job. So at that time, it had a board with 5 engineers and 1 accountant. An accountant was there to make sure nobody steals money. Okay, so a very good system they had. Then the government in 1998 came with what was called the white paper on privatization. So the idea was this is a nationalized utility, and now we need to unbundle it, move it towards privatization, which is not a bad idea. Texas has it, all these things, right?
Right.
But the minister who implemented it was a minister from the South African Communist Party, and I'm not really kidding you. Okay. So,
Oh, yeah.
okay, so privatization must be used in very big inverted commas here. With the privatization, they created what was called NERSA, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, and they gave them the right to fix a tariff. Now, in what private market do you fix a price? Okay. Then they said, okay, Eskom, you're not allowed to build any more power stations because the private sector is going to do it. But here's the problem. They fixed the tariff too low. They subsidized electricity. So the private sector looked at it and said, there's no fat in that system. We can't invest into South Africa. Eskom said, look, if we keep on subsidizing electricity, our debt's going to explode. So government gave them debt extensions, right? Then here by 2002 to 2008, demand starts going up because all the black people of the apartheid years didn't have electricity, and then they started getting on grid. So obviously demand goes up. So in a market system, that price should shoot up. So there's investment, right? But
Right.
government artificially kept it low. So what happened then? Government in 2008 panicked, and they said, okay, we need more coal power stations. That's when coal was not that dirty yet. And then the Eskom said, but we don't have money because we've basically indebted this utility through this policy thing. So government said to them, you will use the maintenance budget to build those 2 power stations. Okay. Now you must take into account South Africa used to be experts in coal power construction. Back in those days, you could just buy a station from the South Koreans or Japanese. They come and put it up, and it's like buying a car. No,
Right.
we said we can still do it. We're arrogant enough. But you actually fired the planning office in the early 90s. So all your engineers had no training. So the engineers who started working on it, there was 2 or 3 civil engineers on that project, right? So it went over budget, and those stations are not even properly done yet. 2 of them have started this year, but they're 15 years delayed. They're over budget, cost estimates, and that's caused rolling blackouts in South Africa. Government has finally 2 years ago lifted this restriction on private generation. It was illegal to do so. So that's why we had rolling blackouts. Okay.
Mm.
So this is a tragedy of note. Then there's also corruption. The ruling party, the African National Congress, started milking the energy policy. So those coal power stations, they had an investment company called Chancellor House, who basically gave kickbacks to the government to stay in power, right? So they were getting big deals on the coal station. Then also the president's brother-in-law currently is the biggest investor in renewable energy in the country. Okay, this is really a banana republic. I'm sorry, the
Oh
way
my
they are
gosh.
managing a democratic, this is not honor a democratic society. So I gave a presentation last week in the South African parliament to the portfolio committee on energy, and I spelled out all these facts. People can start seeing those things. But they basically ran what was one of the best coal fleets in the world into the ground. And this is I'm going to quote Noam Chomsky. I know many people on Texas, but he said the technique of privatization is you make sure it doesn't work, you break it, and you hand over to the private sector.
Exactly.
This is exactly what they're doing here. This is privatizing gain, socializing loss. And who is the private sector? It's the president's brother-in-law. So it's not really a free market, is it? It's crony capitalism. And that's a sweet story of just how to not run an energy system.
Well, trust me, I mean, South Africa is not the only country that has crony capitalism going on. I mean, our Secretary of Energy here in the United States, Jennifer Granholm, we have found out, of course, after the fact that she owned a lot of investments in electric vehicle companies and in wind companies, right?
Right.
That she has sold at strategic points in time when the values were high. And, so I mean, that's all we're doing in the United States anymore is crony capitalism. And it's, we're in the same boat y'all are in. We're just a little bit behind in the process.
The nice thing about the US, though, is that you guys have a federal system. So if
Yes.
one government goes too crazy, another one can pivot away a little bit. We don't. We
Right.
basically have a central government, even if it's democracy. And that's the
Yeah.
problem. We all feel the pain collectively. And the problem is now, what's going to happen to the utilities debt, for example? And South Africa is now going to do the bad thing that Japan did in the 70s and 80s, which is change our bad decisions into debt, as opposed to let the bankruptcies run its way. Now, we have 30% unemployment at the moment. 2/3 of all men are out of work. All young men, sorry, of the youth is out of work. So it's incredible high. We need electricity on the grid. And this is what a plea I make to people in Texas, whatever. The best and fastest way South Africa to alleviate load shedding is get LNG into South Africa. I don't know how you do it. Phone John Kerry or your ambassadors and say, look, there's Richards Bay. I've written an article that you've shared as well on Richards Bay being a case study. That case study has been done by so many engineering companies. Okay, I'll put my name next to it. I can send it all for free. That's where we need an LNG import facility so natural gas can scale up and bring electricity to people. Forget about all the other solutions. That is the quickest way to alleviate poverty in South Africa at the moment.
Yeah, and of course LNG is in high demand all over the world for similar
Right.
reasons, in dozens and dozens of countries, developing nations all over the world. One of the things that fascinates me about South Africa is, of course, you're a member of BRICS. You're the S in BRICS.
Right.
And BRICS just announced it's massively expanding its membership, UAE and Saudi Arabia among the countries coming into BRICS. Do you see BRICS playing a bigger role as we go through time in the energy space? Because, with the expanded membership now, you have 2 of the 3 biggest oil producing countries and 2 of the largest oil consuming countries in that alliance. And then, of course, Brazil is also a huge oil producer that's beginning to grow again. I just wonder what your take is on BRICS and the influence it might exert in the energy space in the future.
So I'll put it this way. Let me describe BRICS. I wrote an article with Joel Kotkin titled The New Great Game in Energy. And I do think there's a part of that playing, but I don't think BRICS is a strategic, it's a complicated alliance. Let me put it this way. Why? Take India, for example. India's historical foreign policy has been non-alignment. We stay out of all major conflicts and war. We buy oil from Russia, even though they invade Ukraine. We don't care. Okay, that's India's policy. So India said, how can we lock the great powers into negotiation? So India made a trade alliance with China, but they're part of Quad, which is a military alliance with the United States of America. So BRICS has got very interesting players where it comes down to strategic non-alignment. South Africa is trying to do this as well. I don't think we're all that successful. So yes, China is our biggest trading partner, 30%. But if you add United States plus Japan plus the Western European countries, it's bigger than China. Yeah. So we are still dependent on the United States of America. There's no question of that. And I think it'll be really tragic if we just walk away from a relationship with the US, because we get along nicely with America. We cooperated on small modular nuclear reactors with the US, for example, for years. Yeah. So, I'd like the door to be open for both parties. And I think our survival strategy from an energy perspective has been, let's invite both parties in. That should be our approach to it. So if the Chinese want to come and invest into energy, they find they can do it. Russia has now signed a gas deal with South Africa, which is fine, but let's not provoke the US. I don't want the CIA to instigate a coup d'etat in our country. You need to invite both countries in for investment. Then BRICS makes sense to me. But if BRICS is going to be an alliance where we say we only buy from BRICS countries, we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot. Because, we are 1%. Our US is like 30% of our foreign trade, more or less. We are less than 1%. South Africa's economy is the size of Maryland. Okay. Yeah. So, if the US just lets go of us because of our own stupidity, we're going to crash as well. So I'd like, the level, the field to be balanced a little bit. And then, China is now really big into nuclear. We need nuclear for water dryness. So there's no reason not to cooperate with them on that. But we need LNG as well. And the US is just leading the world in LNG at the age. So I would like to get both technologies from both countries for our own benefit,
Yeah, the U.S. People have no real idea, I think, most people, of the magnitude of our natural gas resource in the United States. The reserves estimates that are public, are a fraction of what the real magnitude is. We probably have 1,000 years worth of natural gas supply under the ground in the United States. Right. So we should be leading the world. And we're going to double capacity supposedly for LNG exports in the next 5 years, and that's good. And so, yeah, hopefully that LNG is going to be readily available.
I'll say it this way. LNG worldwide is a buyer's market. There's 40 players. So there's geopolitics, but it's really tight competition. Now, South Africa has some of the 7th largest gas reserves in the world, but it's far away from a population center. My view is just import gas. It's so cheap. It's not geopolitical dominance. And then, we can also tell the US, listen, we're not only in favor of China. Because I think sometimes we send the message out that, we're going to jump in bed with the Chinese and the Russians and whatever, but we're democracy as well. Trust me, the population feels quite uncomfortable with, having Xi Jinping given the red carpet by our president who's corrupt.
Yeah.
That's not going to fly very long. So, you'd like to have both parties there. And I say it'd be really tragic if BRICS really divides the world in energy policy and other policies as well. It just doesn't make sense. And we're on the South Atlantic. It's an important sea route. All of those things, can play as a benefit for both countries. So I would say we need to stay out of conflicts because we don't have a military that can rival anyone. But we should not try and provoke people because of, this type of attitudes.
Yeah. You mentioned South Africa's natural gas resource, which is mainly onshore. You also have a pretty robust and growing offshore oil and gas sector, right? Off the, southwestern coast of South Africa right now.
Yeah, but
where companies
environmentalists are blocking
beginning to
it.
explore. Right,
So-
yeah.
so
And I wanted to
the-
ask you about that.
Yeah, so the rather ominous sounding Rockefeller Institute is sometimes behind funding people blocking this type of thing. And also next to Namibia, there's now a big oil find. And Namibia, which is just next door to us, has said to hell with the environmentalists, they're going to exploit oil for the benefit of the country. So South Africa still has the projects tied into bad legal legislation, and that needs to be worked out yet. We fortunately have a minister of energy now that's standing up to them and said to hell with you guys, we're going to develop first, and you need to sit down a little bit. And even the Minister of Environmental Affairs have signed the oil deals. So, yeah, we need to exploit those things, right? We don't know the size of it yet. It's always, with oil findings, it's always speculative. Is it the next Saudi Arabia or not? True answers, nobody knows. But as I understand it, Namibia is putting a lot of money and investment into it. And if I now remember, Shell is there. And then also next to South Africa on the other side, natural gas in Mozambique. Right. And there was a bit of terrorism in Cabo Delgado, with Muslim terrorists in north of the country at one stage. That's now been sorted out. And it seems that within 2026, by my sources tell me, that will start pumping natural gas Mozambique. So South Africa, again, is in this beneficial area where we don't actually have to exploit our own resources. We can just import from our neighbors because they are far poorer than us. They need that trade money, and we just need it for energy, right? So that's the situation we're in. We can also exploit locally, but I argue, with any technology, my attitude is always, let's buy first, let's understand it, and then if it makes business sense, you exploit. You don't exploit and then learn and then no, that's going to blow up costs.
Well, I keep hoping that our policymakers in the U.S. and Europe will gain some perspective on all of this and understand that we are unilaterally disarming our own energy security and becoming, we're embarked on a plan that's going to make us increasingly dependent on China for our energy security in the future, and that's insane, and we can't do it. What I keep telling people, and I wonder what you're feeling on this, is for all of this madness that we saw at COP28, this global religion on climate change, for any of that to change, we're going to have a major and probably deadly energy crisis in the future before these politicians in the Western world start to relent on all this madness. I wonder what you think about that.
So I have a proposal to settle the debate, which I wrote on my Substack, an article, Energy as a Service. So what I'm increasingly skeptical of is selling energy in kilowatt hours. I'd much rather sell it as a service like cell phone contracts. So I explain to people this way. I started my career in telecommunications before I went to energy. This cell phone contract of mine costs a fixed price every month, right? And then the data is almost unlimited. It's like 25, 30 gigabytes, but I never pull all of it, right? And whether I phone my mother 3 or 4 or 5 times a month, it doesn't matter. The cost is the same. Why? Because the cost isn't determined by what happens during operation. It's what happens during an emergency, because there's a cell phone tower. And when lightning strikes it, people run with their pickup trucks with diesel to get that thing going. Otherwise, they lose market share. Okay, that's how competitive that industry is. Now, here's my issue with the renewables. They're wonderful when they work. But a few months ago, a cloud went over South Africa, and all our solar fell by 15%. So if you have 100, you're 15. What do you do during that period? What is your battery? How big is your battery? Do you want to back up the entire grid, right? So what are the Germans doing when there's what we call Dunkelflaute, when there's no wind and no sun for the winter months? It can last 150 hours sometimes even longer. Well, they kickstart their coal fleet.
Exactly.
Now the Germans are saying, but we're using less coal. That's true. They're still stockpiling South African coal, by the way. Anyways, what happens if you use an asset for only 2 or 3 months of the year? It's an economically inefficient usage of the asset because a coal station has to run all the time to almost break even. Now you run for 2 days of the year, the price shoots up during those 2 to 3 days, right? And that's why German electricity prices, household residential, is the second highest in the world, only next to Denmark that's using wind as well. So my view is, why don't we price electricity in a fixed tariff, fixed price, and then you can have a variable price still with the kilowatt hours because you don't want somebody to, put the lights on, have a jacuzzi when you can't afford it, things of that sort. And then the rate of kilowatt hour will go down a little bit. Okay. And what is going to happen then? Well, let me tell you what's going to happen. We need to look to the most greenest state in America, which is California. They recently slapped a fixed tariff on because the solar panels are putting the utilities into bankrupt. And when you put that in, many of these renewable assets on people's roofs will be stranded. I'm sorry to tell you guys, that's the next one. And I'm waiting for disaster in Texas to happen because who pays for backup? Who pays when the wind drops low? That is my question here. And at the moment, what is happening, the guys with renewables on their roof are not paying what we call the full cost of electricity. Right. They are passing those service costs onto the poorest households. And that's just an injustice. You're not allowed to incur costs onto others. You need to pay the full price. And if you're still competitive with that, you've won the argument. Okay, so you shouldn't be scared of a competitive market framework. I'm not choosing one source over another because I think renewables are wonderful where they work. But exactly. I'm very much, I want the rules of the games to be established so the price is driven by what happens, not during good days when there's lots of sun and wind, during bad days when there's none. And that price must be carried over by the renewable contractors. They should have firm supply contractors. No matter what you do, that is the price you deliver. Not you get the free price when you want. That's what I'm against.
Well, we are running up against time. These half hours go too fast. But before we go, I want to give you time to tell people where they can follow you, where they can support the work you do. I know you have your own Substack. Give them the address and wherever else they can find you.
So yeah, the Substack is Hugo's newsletter. They can look